They're two happy women bringing you inspiring stories, politics, pop culture, and lifestyle hacks, all with an eye to making our communities and our country a better place to live. It's the Happy Women Podcast with your hosts, Jen Horn and Katie Gorka.
Thanks for joining us and welcome to another episode of the Happy Women Podcast. I'm Jennifer Horn.
And I'm Katie Gorka.
And we're so glad to have you with us today. And as we record this, we are in the midst of DNC week. The Democrat National Convention is underway in Chicago. We'll talk about that. We'll go through some of the similarities with the protesters there and really kind of give a state of the race. But Katie, I have to ask you before we jump in, because we always love to talk about things that we've done, what we've seen. I finally caught up with you. I saw Twisters over the weekend, which I absolutely loved. The special effects, if you need to get tensed up about a tornado and be happy you live in an earthquake zone like I do in California, this is a movie for you. I do not want to see a tornado ever, but it was such a great movie. And I thought of you the whole way through. They could have been so much more heavy-handed with the climate change stuff. And it was okay. It was fine. I mean, it was just, there was nothing obnoxious about Twisters. I thought it was very, very cute and good.
Yeah, good.
You traveled and you went to the Museum of Military Vehicles and you're like, Jen, I know I'm a nerd. And I said, no, this is the kind of stuff that I think is really fun. What did you learn about at the Museum of Military Vehicles?
So I have to tell you, the whole experience so much made me think about you because we love to highlight the stories of people that go out. And I know we mostly focus on women, but there are some guys doing this too. We love to focus on the stories of people that see a problem and they go out and fix it. People that are out doing incredible things to save our country, to make their communities better. And this, to me, is just one of those perfect stories. So you take this guy, Dan Starks. He is a very successful CEO of a Fortune 500, medical implements company, medical devices company. And, he himself did not serve in the military, but has always had a tremendous respect for the military and was feeling increasingly frustrated that we were not telling the story of our own country in our kids' schools, and we're not telling the story of the incredible contributions of our military or the ways that America has really contributed to freedom of people around the globe.
Yeah.
So he started collecting because he was successful and made money. He was able to amass this extraordinary collection of weapons, military vehicles, memorabilia, all kinds of stuff. And he has created one of the most beautiful, stunning museums I have ever seen. It's called the National Museum of Military Vehicles, but it's really so much more than that. And this is in Du Bois, Wyoming. So it's I'm guessing is about probably an hour and 15 from downtown Jackson Hole. Mm-hmm. So worth the trip. And we were blessed to have him give our group. We got to have a whole private tour with him, but it just really tells an incredible story of our military, how they evolved, how they developed. I have to say, for the first time ever, I feel like I actually understand the Korean War, which was one of those things. Even though my stepfather fought in it, he'd never talked about it, and I just knew very little about it. I learned so much, and I just want to say it's really worth a stop.
Some of those little museums that you don't hear much about really are the ones that are just absolutely amazing. So good. I wanted to make sure we didn't forget about that.
Well, and especially today when so many of our cultural institutions have been taken over by wokeness. One of my colleagues at the Heritage Foundation did an incredible body of research on how many of our presidents' homes have been just completely taken over by the oppressor
libraries that I can think of.
Right, exactly.
So, influence as well. Yeah.
And so you get private individuals standing up to that and saying, I'm not going to go with that narrative.
Right.
And yet the museum showed incredible diversity. He's got this sort of initial wall of photographs, and it's just, women and men and all ethnicities and the contributions of everybody. And I just think there is a way to sort of address the diversity that's not smacking you over the head with it.
You know what? I'm with you on that. And I think it's good to highlight those places because you're right. Some of our most treasured places get taken over and you're like, oh, just want some place to go. Without that, I just want a good look. All right. So as we chat today, the DNC, the Democrat National Convention, is underway in Chicago. And I think it's worth talking about what's going on inside the convention, but certainly maybe we should start on the outside because, well, a lot of conventions will give away like a free tote bag. But at the DNC this year, they're giving away free abortions and free vasectomies and apparently are sold out on that offering. Yet apparently it's the Republicans that are the weirdos. I mean, I think that sounds pretty weird to me, but that's one of the things going on outside. We also have a lot of protesters. They were expecting, I heard people say tens of thousands, maybe even up to 100,000 in total protesters coming through Chicago, particularly anti-Israel, pro-Hamas protesters who are out there. And you can be sure as soon as the protesters show up, guess what also shows up? We've got the encampments going up. We've got the tents that are making their way throughout the city of Chicago, Katie. And it's very reminiscent, I think, of times past. And I know you've had some observations about this and some correlations to draw with the days of rage.
Yeah. So, because of writing my book, Next Gen Marxism, I really had to dig deep into the history of radicalism. And I did a lot of research on the sort of 60s radicalism of the students. So I was particularly intrigued that they are throwing around the phrase with regard to the protesters at this convention, make it great, like 68. Right. They want it to be sort of a throwback to the disruption, the incredible violence and disruption of the 68 Democratic National Convention, also in Chicago. But I find the parallels are even deeper, and I find it so interesting. So, as you said, they were kind of warning, and they were expecting about 30,000 protesters to show up. As our producer Misty was telling us earlier, apparently there are stacks and stacks of signs because the people aren't there to carry the signs. They've only had about 5,000.
I hate a no-show. They respond to the Evite and then they just don't come.
But I thought this was really interesting too, because the lesser known series of protests that took place in Chicago was the sort of infamous Days of Rage. It was the next year. It was October 8th to 11th, 1969. Students for a Democratic Society were billing this as bring the war home, right? They were, fighting. They wanted basically Marxist revolution. They wanted an end to the Vietnam War. They wanted, a whole new civil rights regime. So they planned for this huge demonstration to happen. And they got 300 people to show up. And they had, the people in the community utterly derided them, threw rocks down on them, didn't want this happening. They did not have the support that they thought that they would have. And it really, that kind of marked the end of the student revolution. I mean, they sort of then dissipated and went different directions. Some went terrorist, some went into universities, some went into organizing. But I'm just going to be really curious to see how this goes for the next couple of days. Are we going to see actually a greater blossoming of what started on our university campuses back in the spring? Or is this going to start to be the end? And right now, it doesn't look so good for these guys. I hope this is the end of it. But I think it's also very, very interesting what this says about the Democratic Party, because I feel like they are over a barrel. One way or another, they are either going to totally isolate and alienate their Jewish supporters, even moderate secular Jewish supporters, or they're going to alienate their pro-Hamas wing, which is very, very vocal. So I'd love to see how the Democrats get themselves out of this one.
And if you look at night number 1, which is now in the books of the DNC, the people on that stage are supporters really kind of the pro-Hamas wing of the party. Very few of the traditional kind of moderate pro-Israel Democrats that were up on the stage. That wasn't an issue for the first night, but it was very telling by looking at their list of speakers. And I'm curious to know, too, because I think so much of what happens with these protesters is what we allow to happen. Watching what went on college campuses at the end of the last school year, it was ridiculous to me that the campuses just let them sort of congregate, prevent Jewish students from going to school. But they just had an injunction filed against UCLA from a judge who actually is now demanding that the school has to protect Jewish students. Now, that seems ridiculous and basic. And you would actually think that the school, that UCLA, would be grateful to have that ruling so that they have something to tell the protesters that I do think will come back once school gets into session. But the school has now filed a motion to fight the injunction by the judge, so that they don't have to protect their Jewish students. So I really believe that this movement will have life as long as we allow it to. And if these schools, which are getting back into session now, UCLA will be back in session in September. The UC schools are a little later. If they allow it, I think it'll continue to grow. And it is interesting to see where there are multiple fractures in the Democrat Party right now that a lot of the mainstream media doesn't want to talk about. And this is definitely one of them. And I think it's a far bigger problem than the Democrats want to let on. So they push these protesters back, from what I hear, by a mile. So maybe that's what pushes some of the steam out of the protesters, if people aren't going to see them because they're a mile away from the actual area where important faces might get to consume them. So if you start to soften, however, and you listen to Joe Biden's speech and you listen to what Kamala Harris has said and you listen to the little bits that have started to filter out, Joe Biden laid on us on Monday night the line that he loves to take President Trump apart for. And that is that there are good people on both sides, right? That Charlottesville hoax that Biden has been echoing over and over again. Guess what he said in his farewell speech? He said that in this conflict with the protesters, that there are good people fighting for good reasons on both sides. This is Joe Biden, who is about the most moderate that you can get, because he remembers the old days when we're supposed to stand with Israel, right? At all costs. If that's him softening, you can only imagine what crazy progressive Kamala Harris is going to say next.
Well, the other interesting thing to watch will be, if you look again at the parallels to 1968 and 1969, the fact that by the time of the Days of Rage, you had sort of boiled it down to the most hardcore, who were the ones that showed up. But the fact that they were really kind of defeated by the police, pushed aside the way the protesters are right now, that is also ultimately what drove them into an even deeper form of radicalism. It was a very small group, but it was the Weather Underground. And then they went into a period of several years of really rampant terrorism. So I also think it's going to be interesting to see if that's what happens here too. I think on the one hand, what we're seeing is some of these protest movements are losing steam, but I worry about what's going to happen to the hardcore center. And whether we see acts of terrorism or more extreme violence as a result of this.
The shift.
Yep.
That was one of the things. So that's outside the convention. Inside the convention, it is so weird to watch. First of all, I decided to torture myself and watch night one of the Democrat convention on MSNBC because, I don't know, I just thought it might be fun. And I heard this word, and I'm seeing it more and more now, and I can guarantee you this is the word that's going to come out, and it's joy. Instead of talking about policy, instead of talking about issues, the Democrats are totally hiding what they think because they know they have this split in the party and that no one is actually going to be happy with where they come down. Kamala Harris is one of the most schizophrenic transactional candidates that you'll find. She will do anything to get elected, but they don't want to actually hammer down where they stand on most of these issues, especially because Joe Biden has failed the American people for the past 4 years. So they're talking about joy and how Kamala Harris is a joy-filled candidate and that people feel joyful sitting in that convention. And it is kind of smart branding for the low information voter who says, do I want to be joyful and vote for Kamala Harris, a joyful candidate? Or do I want to go for President Trump, the mean old nasty white guy who's been here and he says mean things and sends out mean tweets? This is what Democrats are banking on now, that it's going to be about emotions, not about what people actually know and feel at their grocery store, the pain of finances, the economy, the crime, the safety. It's an interesting play when you have nothing to run on. I just wonder if it's going to be hollow for the American voter. I hope so.
Well, I was struck. I was reading the party platform this morning, which I guess they'll be voting on in a couple of days. I don't know when the actual vote takes place, but it said that one of the quotes early on, "We will lower the temperature in our politics and come together."
Right.
And I just thought that is the ultimate hypocrisy. But you know what I've loved, and I'm sure you've seen some of these too, the interviews with Kamala supporters, where the interviewer will say, "So do you like Kamala's policies?" And they'll be like, "Yes, they're really great." Okay, name what is a particular policy that you really like? And it's nothing. They've got crickets. And that's what, I mean, I think that they really have managed to avoid taking a hard line. But I'm telling you what, the party platform has their radicalism on full display. They are not going to be able to get out of this at this point because they've put it down on paper. And when the American people see what the Democrats are proposing, you know, particularly in the area of immigration, it is shocking. And I think people will be shocked.
I also thought it was pretty interesting that on a night that was supposed to be about honoring Joe Biden and about passing the torch to Kamala Harris, I thought, look, I'm no fan of Joe Biden's, but they made him stand around and wait and wait and wait and wait. This was an event that was directed by Steven Spielberg, for crying out loud, and they couldn't get it right. The speeches were long. They were bloated. They had too much shoved into too little time. And these Democrats love to hear themselves talk. So they never got off the stage. They had to cut the performer. They had to cut Debbie Wasserman Schultz. They had to cut a lot of speakers just to get Biden on stage before midnight. So he lost his chance at a primetime address. I thought it was really disrespectful from a party that did nothing but disrespect him and the American people, by the way, by cutting out the candidate that was voted for during the primary process. And if you heard Nancy Pelosi, CNN got a hold of her, and maybe Misty, you might be able to find the clip. If not, I'll paraphrase here.
Have you talked to him? Is my only question.
What I have to do.
Right.
He made the decision for the country. My concern was not about the president, it was about his campaign.
Nancy Pelosi to Jake Tapper says, "I did what I had to do." When she was asked about her relationship with Joe Biden, "I did what I had to do. I did it for the election. I didn't consider the president. I was considering the campaign." And to watch her have to shout, "We love Joe," as he comes out on stage crying and hugging his daughter, what an awkward affair. And I don't care who you are. There have got to be a lot of hurt feelings and anger in that party right now, particularly for Joe Biden and the loyalists to him.
And I just have to make the point as well, the fact that they kept him up so late and got him onto the stage so late, I thought was really reflected in the quality of his speech. I mean, there was some very serious sort of slurring and like, oh, what did he just say? So yes, all around disrespectful and, you know, really dishonored his legacy and his past. So.
I know. Off he goes. And did he get the send off that I think he thought he was going to get? I definitely, none of this, I think, is on his own terms. And it shows the disrespect, I think, ultimately that the party has. And here's why. They've moved from bringing in people who are actually going to run the country, ideologues, people like Bernie Sanders, by the way, who I have no love for, but Bernie Sanders stands for something. He can't be controlled. This is why they can throw Joe Biden out, because they brought him in because he was a useful pawn for them to use to win an election. But it was never about him. And that's the same thing for Kamala Harris. She is a useful pawn. She is a useful tool, and she'll be discarded when she's no longer useful, because that's what the party is doing. That's the kind of leader they're looking for now. And that's what puts Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, on that list. They are looking for empty suits that can be manipulated until they are no longer necessary. It's pretty sad when you think about it.
But I think they're really putting their foot in it at the same time, because look at Tim Walz. I mean, the more that we learn about him, and particularly his ties to China.
Yes.
I mean, it's pretty shocking the amount of time he spent there. Have you seen the story about one of his classmates? So he went over to China as an exchange student, and then went over subsequently another 31 times, got married to his wife on the 5th anniversary of the massacre at Tiananmen Square.
He's a full-fledged nut. I mean,
he's a full-fledged Maoist nut.
He is absolutely right, because this is somebody who has really, we laughed about Bernie Sanders honeymooning in Russia. That's far less damaging than someone who's celebrating the massacre at Tiananmen Square on his wedding anniversary and chose that date purposefully.
And the student, his fellow student who's been coming forward with these stories really is coming out and saying that Walz was a very committed Maoist. I think enough Americans have woken up to the reality of China. They're not ignorant about what's going on. I don't think anybody has a Pollyanna-ish idea about China being benign. Okay, maybe some of our heads of our big corporations and the heads of the Hollywood studios, but I think most Americans recognize that China is a force for evil in the world. They absolutely see themselves as our enemy. They see us as their enemy. Yep. So I don't see how this is going to go down well with anybody. The question is, will the word get out, or will the mainstream media continue to effectively whitewash the records of both Walz and Harris?
Which they're doing.
I know.
They're allowing, I don't know if you heard about this, but the campaign, and we may have talked about this, but the campaign, and this is legal, was using Google ads to basically change headlines to make them very favorable for Kamala Harris. Well, actually, a radio station, now this was in one of the radio trades, it has not made mainstream news, but one of the radio stations who had a headline changed is actually suing the Harris campaign now for using their intellectual property, but trying to adjust what the headline actually looked like. So we'll see how that plays out. Now, you sent me an interesting article. One of the things, as every campaign, whether you win or not, typically campaigns think they are going to win. And they have transition teams that are set up in an effort to make sure it's a smooth transition to get their candidate put into office. It's a huge amount of people, a huge amount of personnel, a huge amount of responsibility. And you sent me a really interesting article, and I think for a number of reasons. Number one, in 2016, when President Trump won the first time, one of the criticisms was that he wasn't ready to go quick enough and out the gate, which allowed a lot of swamp creatures to kind of make their way into his inner circle and into his administration, which prevented him from doing work. And he had a lot of sabotage. But we're just learning that his transition team is getting started once again. Biden's has already started, I think, and he doesn't need it, obviously, because he's the incumbent to the same extent. But he started his in 2020 back in June. So there's a time lapse here. But there are some other things that are pretty good. Number one, the leadership that he has chosen to take his transition team kind of as the figureheads. You want to talk about that a little bit? Because you actually worked on Trump's transition team back in 2016. So it's important to have great leaders, as well as the people who are going to be in there really doing the work.
Volatility and uncertainty are everywhere we turn. Many Americans have grown increasingly tired of the reckless fiscal spending, mounting national debt, and the looming threat to the dollar. With never-ending political and global conflicts, Americans are looking for a way out of the fragile paper system and craving a trustworthy asset to help protect their savings. That's why they turn to gold. Specifically, a gold IRA from Augusta Precious Metals. If you have over $100,000 in a retirement account, it's time you learned about the potential benefits of a gold IRA from Augusta Precious Metals. Augusta Precious Metals is a world-class organization that prides itself on top-notch service. Ready to learn more? Get your free guide on gold IRAs today by calling 855-222-6994. Volatility is everywhere. Now is the time to take control of your retirement to secure a brighter financial future with Augusta Precious Metals. Call them at 855-222-6994 today. Yeah, and part of the problem in 2016 is that the first leader of transition was Chris Christie. And so then when Chris Christie was thrown out, they had to kind of start from scratch. And, transition is super important. I mean, it was very insightful for me to be part of the transition team. You don't realize, but the moment inauguration is completed, the new administration has to be ready. Imagine there's an attack like 2 hours later, right? You've got the reins of government at that point. So transition goes on for months beforehand, people getting ready, starting to identify people to take positions, developing policies so that you know what you're going to do when you can hit the ground running. So yes, news has just been announced about the Trump transition. Two things about it that I found super interesting. One is I love the two people that they have named as co-chairs of transition. Now, they have not yet named an executive director, and that will be very important. But the co-chairs, I think, are great. So Linda McMahon, who you and I are both big fans of hers, incredible businesswoman. And she served as head of the Small Business Administration during the Trump presidency. And she's been chair of the board of the America First Policy Institute.
And she also really gets it. You know, I had just to jump in on her for a second. Several years ago, actually, when Sebastian was working in the White House, because I actually saw him there, which was funny because we obviously were friends beforehand, but we broadcasted from the lawn. The morning show in LA, all of the Salem shows went and broadcasted from the lawn of the White House, which was just an amazing, fun, thrilling day, obviously. And they had lots of members of the cabinet come out, the secretaries and such, to do interviews with us. And Linda McMahon was one of the people that we got to sit with. What struck me about her, she got the fact, because everybody goes, oh, well, the WWE is this huge corporation. It wasn't always. They operated out of the back, literally out of the trunk of a car. And when you hear her story about how they went from literally an office inside of their car with the trunk as their office space to WWE headquarters right now, you realize that she knows business every step of the way. And of course, she did great work for the Small Business Administration. She really struck me as someone who gets it. You know, a lot of time when people get into higher positions or they run these big corporations, they forget the people who struggle. That was not what it seemed like with her. So I really liked that. I liked seeing her at the RNC sitting next to President Trump, and I'm really glad she's part of this team.
I am too. And I think you cannot have people in leadership who have only ever served in government.
That's
right.
right.
But it's not what America's about. And no wonder they have an easy time spending our money, because they don't understand the value of money and how hard it is to build a successful business. So I'm 100% with you. The other person that I was really excited by, and it's partly because the Marine Corps Foundation honored him at a lunch. Sebastian used to teach for the Marine Corps, so we got to be at the lunch. And so I heard his stories. I heard him speak, and I just think the world of him. It's Howard Lutnick. He is the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald. And you had remembered this story, but at the time of the September 11th attacks, Cantor Fitzgerald had their offices on the 101st through the 105th floors.
Yeah.
Every single person in that office, it was almost 700 people, every single one died. And the only reason Lutnick didn't is because he was taking his son to the first day of kindergarten.
It's amazing.
But it goes even deeper. The incredible thing that he did then, and this is what he was honored for by the Marine Corps Foundation, is he made a commitment he established a foundation, and they are paying the college tuitions of all the kids of the people whose parents died that day. So I just think, not only is he an extraordinarily successful businessman, but he's clearly someone with huge compassion, huge heart, sense of charity. And again, I think that is a really important quality for anybody who's going to serve in any way or be associated with government. Because again, what this country is built on is not just, the profit motive, right? There's got to be the whole empathy, the charity piece to it as well. That those who do well and do succeed look after those who are less fortunate, and that it can be done by private individuals. It doesn't have to be done by government, which is the Democrat view.
We can take care of our people. We don't need the government to do it. I think it's a huge message. But one of the things that I don't want to run out of time to talk about, because maybe the most interesting piece of this story is where they're locating their offices. And we all can remember that moment. When President Trump used to say things, you might go, oh gosh, was that really true? And then every time he'd say something that seemed a little crazy, it always ended up being true. And one of the first examples of that is when he came out and said, Obama's spying on me. And we all went, oh, come on. But he was. I mean, maybe it wasn't directly Obama, but it certainly was the government spying on President Trump. And this is one of the things that they're taking note of as they set up transition moving into his next administration.
Absolutely. So it was so interesting because the way it works is the government, the General Services Administration, gives office space to both candidates' transition teams. So we were on the 7th floor. Hillary's team was on the 11th floor. You always had to be careful about what conversation you were having in the elevator. But I don't think, and they provide electronic equipment. They provide computers, right? And, I certainly had no thought at that time that we were being spied on. And it turns out we were. And that was one of the ways that the Obama administration was able to undermine the incoming Trump administration from the very beginning. So I was personally super excited actually to see that Trump transition, they have announced that they will not be using the office space given by the GSA, nor will they use any of the electronic equipment. And they are going to go do it their own way. And I think that is super smart. Yep.
Absolutely. I mean, why would you get burnt twice? And you know that this time it's not going to slow down. If President Trump wins, you better hope we have a House of Representatives that's run by Republicans, because otherwise they'll be working on impeachment. You'll have the government apparatus that is still going to be trying to spy to protect themselves, because President Trump for this term is going to go in there and try to get rid of some of this overreach, some of the stuff we call the swamp, dismantle some of that at the highest levels. And what do cockroaches do when they're threatened, right? They want to fight back and burrow in deeper. And so you can expect that this is not going to be smooth sailing. So I think it's very wise that he's got that in his mind, that he needs to protect himself, his assets, and of course the people who are going to be working with him during the transition. Pretty interesting stuff. All right. Well, that is another episode. How about that? Want to tell you guys, make sure you get Katie's book. It's called Next Gen Marxism. You can get it wherever you get your books. You can also check her out online. Her website is katiegorka.org. You can find her on Facebook. Just search out Catherine Gorka. And of course, you can find me too, Facebook and Instagram at Jennifer Horn Radio, and on Truth and X at Jennifer Horn. And thank you so much for the 5-star reviews. If you have time, please share Happy Women with your friends. We take men here too. We don't just have women. Everybody's welcome. You can connect with all of us, video, YouTube, Rumble, all of the different platforms at SalemPodcastNetwork.com. Thanks for joining us. It's another episode of the Happy Women Podcast.